Hi everyone, this is Donna from Heaven to Earth Ministries, and I want to thank you for joining us today. And today we're going to continue our series on the book of Esther. So if you were with us last week, we talked about King Xerxes and the big half-year celebration he had, and the 7-day feast that ended that celebration with a lot of wine and gluttony and all that stuff. And the reason that he had this feast was because he was trying to gain favor because he felt he could go and conquer the Greek Empire. During this time, the events led to him on the 7th day of the banquet. He was so drunk. He ordered his wife, Queen Vashti, to come and show herself to his guest, and of course this was basically obscene type of gesture, and Queen Vashti refused to do it, and as a result he basically exiled her, and is what we know today as basically a divorce. He basically divorced her and exiled her. So today in chapter 2, we're going to continue this story. So stay tuned so we can get into chapter 2 and learn the events that follow this divorce from Queen Vashti. So in chapter 2 of Esther takes place 4 years later. So it's been 4 years that King Xerxes has been without a queen. He went to conquer the Greek Empire as he, through his celebration, convinced everybody he could do. Unfortunately, that did not work out, and he failed miserably and did not conquer that empire. So we're going to continue this story. We're going to introduce you to a couple individuals here who were Jews. One was Mordecai, and the other was his cousin Esther. Esther had lost her parents, so Mordecai basically raised her as his own. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll start reading chapter 2, verses 1 through 4 of the book of Esther. Later, when the anger of King Xerxes had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Now notice here in verse 1, the word decreed is used, and basically that's telling us that he could not go back on that decree. So there was no way he could get Vashti back or remarry her. So verse 2, then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful girls into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the woman, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Again, we're learning a little bit more about King Xerxes here. First of all, he wanted all these he was going to have all these young virgins brought to him. And as the story continues, we're going to learn what some of the stipulations are, or the consequences are, for these girls who were brought before the king in his search for a new queen. So let's go ahead and we're going to talk about verses 2 5 through 9, and this talks about a providential agreement. So this is where we're going to be introduced to Mordecai. So verses 5 through 9. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Now Mordecai had a cousin named Hadashai, whom he brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This girl, who was also known as Esther, was lovely in form and features, and Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many girls were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hagar. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hagar, who had charge of the harem. The girl pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 maids selected from the king's palace and moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. So here is Esther. She's a Jewish girl, and she is one of these young virgins who were taken to see if they would be the next queen. And of course, for this harem, this was kind of hard because that meant that they would never be able to marry. If they had not been chosen as the next queen, they would remain part of the king's harem. And so, their future was kind of messed up because of this arrangement that had been made by King Xerxes. So now we go into a preparation period, and that is verses 10 through 14. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. So, I want to remind you here that 400 years earlier, the Jews were ordered by God to return to Jerusalem. So the very fact that Mordecai and Esther were here under King Xerxes in Susa show that they did not obey that command, but chose instead to stay where they were. So I find this to be an interesting point because even though they had been disobedient to this order, as we'll see the more we read in Esther, God still used them for his purpose. And that's the same with us. We may think that we're not worthy of being used by God because of our imperfections or our previous sins, but God can use us still. God knows that we're imperfect and that we do make mistakes and we don't always do everything perfectly, but he can still use us. So you can still be used by God no matter what sins you may have committed before. Okay, so Esther had not revealed her nationality or family background because Mordecai forbidden her to do so, so that meant nobody knew she was a Jew. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a girl's turn came to go to King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the woman. 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem to the care of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. So, I'm sure that this had to have been a very, very stressful situation for Esther and for Mordecai both. not knowing what was happening. I mean, Mordecai was pretty much out of the loop, not knowing for an entire year that she was going through these treatments, not knowing what was going to happen to her. She had no idea what was going to happen to her. And yet, this was a situation we were in, or she was in. And, if we bring that to now, sometimes we're in situations like this where we just don't know what's going to happen next. We're stressed. We just, all we can do in times like this is wait on God and leave things in God's hands, because no matter how concerned or how stressed they were, nothing was going to change unless God chose to change it. So that's the time that we would want to just continually put our faith in our Father. So now that we've gone through the preparation period, now it's time to see how the king is going to feel and how he proceeds. So we're going to read about that in chapters 15 through 18. When the turn came for Esther, the girl Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king. She asked for nothing other than what Hegai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem, suggested, and Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. I noticed part of this here, how she was pretty humble. It mentions she won the favor of everyone who saw her. Although she was a beautiful woman, it takes more than beauty to win the favor of everyone who saw her. So as we read and we'll be learning throughout this whole story, she was a very humble individual, and she listened. She learned from other people, and she didn't presume to know, what was best. And those were qualities that drew people to her. So in verse 17, now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. So if we can see here how God's hand is involved, and out of all these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of women, Esther was the one who won favor with King Xerxes and became his queen. And at this point in time, it's still nobody knows that she is a Jew. And this is going to be very, very significant in chapters to come, about nobody knowing that she was a Jew. Okay, so now we will go to verse 19. Now we have a pleased king who now has a queen again. We're going to move on to verses 19 through 23. And the theme of these few verses is a providential plot. Remember, providential has to do with God using events to fulfill his purpose. And that purpose may not be instant. It could be a purpose in the future. But being that God knows all things, he knows the way things need to be for the future to work out. So this is a providential plot that God is using for the sake of his people. We may not see it in the plot, but we will in future chapters. It's what makes this such an interesting book in the Bible. So let's read 19 through 23. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do, for she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. So we can see that loyalty, that obedience that comes out of Esther. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, these two guys, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about this plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were hanged on a gallows. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. So here was this plot, and Esther became aware of the plot by means of Mordecai. She relayed this to the king and let the king know that it was Mordecai who brought this to her attention. And the gallows, if we go back into history, we're going to find that the gallows weren't exactly what we think of when we think of gallows today. If we go back to the original wording, it was a lot like a crucifixion, like Jesus had gone through. So these men who plotted to assassinate King Xerxes really did have to endure something. And all of this was because Queen Esther had been put into place by God. Now, this is the end of our story from chapter 2. But there are certain principles that we want to think about here for our own benefit, because yes, it's a good story and it really shows God's involvement. It really shows God manipulating things. Well, I shouldn't use the word manipulating, but taking advantage of things that are happening to benefit his people. And now we have a queen who is a Jew. Okay, we have Mordecai, who is now been made aware of by the king because he basically saved the king's life. Just imagine, think about today if we did something that revealed an assassination of our president and the president became aware of this, what would he do as far as we were concerned? So God was moving things here. And next week, we're going to go into chapter 3, and we're going to learn some more interesting details about this book. What I would like for you to remember is no matter what situation you may be in right now, maybe that situation seems hopeless, okay? I mean, I'm sure to Mordecai having to send his beloved cousin who he had raised to be one of these hundreds of women that was probably going to end up in the king's harem, what a impossible situation he must have felt that was, and how Esther must have felt the same. I mean, her whole future was in jeopardy here, and yet God maneuvered things for their benefit. We mean the same thing. God can maneuver things for our benefit and the benefit of our brothers and sisters and Christians all around the world. So we never know what God is going to use us for. So whatever your situation today, keep praying, be consistent in prayer. Program your mind with godliness. Maintain a godly attitude. Guard your godly attitude, because just as people were won over by Esther, her beauty was more than external. Her beauty was internal. And the reason she had that internal beauty was because of her dedication to God. So we too have an internal beauty that others see. And because of that, we can win them over to Christ. And what a blessing that would be for them and us. Thank you so much for joining me today. Next week, we're going to go over chapter 3 of Esther, and we're going to learn more about this beautiful story and how God used current events for the advantage of his own people. Thank you. Have a good day. We'll see you next week.